Hi, Professor Dyer here, talking about research in human development and family science. I want to talk for a few minutes about what I call prevalence study designs. These are the studies that are designed basically to count how often something happens, or maybe at what age it happens. We often think of this as background information. Let's say we're interested in infant development and kind of how to know if a child might have early signs of a developmental disability, and then how to treat that, how to intervene to prevent long-term consequences. The first thing you have to know is how often does that particular disability show up in the population. It's a prevalence, it's counting. It's probably not what people started out wanting to know about, but we have to know it. It's the foundation or the background, you might say. People who want to study the impact of parental divorce on kids often start with the question of, well, how often does it happen that people with children of a certain age get divorced? That it's counting. It doesn't seem all that exciting, but I want us to reflect on it for a minute, because it turns out prevalence study designs can often completely change the way we think about whatever that issue is. It's very background information, and it often can kind of set the course of the discussion. We need to do this with research because humans are just so incredibly bad at doing it, for all of the reasons that we have discussed earlier in the book: vividness effect, confirmation bias, etc., etc. We tend to be bad at this. To get us started, stop the video now and write down your guess, without looking it up, of what percentage of two-parent families have both parents employed full-time, what percentage of marriages are very happy, what percentage of 15-year-old boys have ever had sex, what percentage of 12-month-old babies can sleep 8 hours a night, and what percent of new mothers suffer from postpartum depression. Constrain yourself to the United States, but write down what you think are the answers to these questions. Okay, now that we're back, let's look at what the answers to those questions are. The first question: what percentage of families with two parents married to each other have both parents working? You can see here that since 2015, it's been about half. I wonder how close that is to what you had. Sometimes we think that because the historical narrative has changed so drastically, that it's probably going to be close to 100% of two-parent households where both work. Often we have that storyline in our mind that a generation ago, families only had one working parent, but nowadays, for sure, everybody works full-time, and you can see here that the numbers don't support that. We have pretty drastically increased from 31% to 46%, but that leaves more than half that don't fit this mold. All right, the second question: what percentage of marriages are very happy? You can see here that, well, there's a lot of interesting things about this graph. About 63% of men and 59 or 60% of women. So this is one of the interesting points, is that men tend to be happier in their marriages than women do. And we see that the difference doesn't look huge, does it? That's a pretty small difference. You can also see, though, that it looks like marital satisfaction has been slightly declining for the last few decades or so. This might challenge whatever narrative you're walking around in your mind with. A lot of us these days, we hear a lot about divorce. We hear a lot about kind of unhappy marriages, and so you might have assumed that it's pretty darn rare for a marriage to be really happy. And yet the numbers suggest it's more often are people very, very happy than not. The next question: what percentage of, I think I said 15-year-old boys have ever had sex? You can see here We have boys and girls on this graph, but if we look at boys, the answer is about 20% have ever had sex. I would venture to guess that this violates the story you think you know about what's going on with teenage boys. Culturally, we say a lot of terrible things about teenage boys. We talk about them as if they are completely out of control. They're rampaging through the society, violating all norms, and driven entirely by their sexual appetites and so on and so forth. And so many people are surprised that these numbers are as low as they are. Hold that thought. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. The next question was, what percentage of 12-month-old babies sleep through the night? And by sleeping through the night, we may mean 6 hours of sleep uninterrupted, or we may mean 8 hours of sleep. If we mean 6 hours, then it looks like 70% of babies are sleeping through the night by a year old. But if our standard is higher and we say it has to be a good 8 hours, then we're down to 55-ish% of babies who sleep through the night. This might surprise you because our culture has a story that it tells about babies, that their sleep is supposed to be interrupted or unconsolidated for a few months. But most doctors will tell you that by a few months, by 6 months for sure, babies should be sleeping through the night. By 12 months, we often hear kind of from the medical profession, if a baby's not sleeping through the night, that's fundamentally abnormal and something is wrong. And yet the numbers suggest it's not true, that just normatively lots of babies aren't even sleeping for 6 hours, much less the much desired, put them to bed at 8 p.m. and then have a nice uninterrupted, very long night's sleep for everybody else in the house. That only happens about half the time. Yeah, there you go. What percentage of moms have postpartum depression? And you can see that as of 2012 anyway, the number was about 14%. This number typically surprises people. We hear a lot about postpartum depression because it can be so incredibly debilitating. And if you know anyone who has suffered postpartum depression, you know what I mean by that. It can really interfere with a new mother's ability to really enjoy the life of her newborn baby, and anything else about her life. It can be quite serious. And because of the vividness effect, we tend to think it's probably more prevalent than it really is. 14% is a number that typically surprises people that it's that low. Now keep in mind that translates into many, many thousands of people at any given time in the United States, but the number itself is smaller than we usually think it is. So I want you to think about where your guesses came from. Why did you guess what you guessed? And if I kind of know my people, why'd you get so many of them wrong? I've suggested some of the things already when we went through each slide. Our guesses typically come from our personal experiences, which if you stop and think about it, you know that's going to be very limited because we tend to spend time with people who are sort of like ourselves, and we're just not going to have the breadth of personal experience to be able to estimate for the entire United States. Some of our guesses come from the media. And of course, if you stop and think about that, you realize that there's no reason to expect that would be representative of the population. Why is it so hard? We have so many perceptual and cognitive biases that interfere with our ability to generalize, to create generalizable information, all the things we talked about in Chapter 2. But I want you to think about it this way, that none of us go through life with numbers of things as the most important thing in our life. That's just not how we organize our lives as human beings. Instead, we tend to come up with a story, a narrative, an overarching pattern that we think is true. So having a newborn baby is difficult for only a few months. And then babies, if you parent them well anyway, they should be kind of less trouble by 6 or 12 months in. That's a narrative that helps us to make sense of what life is like with a newborn baby. And that narrative is what we carry around. We don't really carry around the actual statistics. We often have a narrative about teenagers being out of control and teenage boys in particular that have sort of a bad rap, and we have a story in our mind about how reckless they are and how difficult. And so the number about how many have had a sexual experience by the time they're 15, that often comes as a surprise because it counteracts the narrative. And so I just submit this as a possibility for us, that the reason we're so bad at guessing prevalence is because we carry around the story. We don't carry around the numbers. And the reason that's important for prevalence research is that often, if we get the numbers right, it can completely change the narrative. And so prevalence research can in fact be sort of revolutionary, can really change things, because it helps us to change the narrative when we look at the accurate numbers instead of the numbers that we infer from our biases that we came to the story with. So get ready, it's going to be a fun discussion of prevalence research.